So, welcome everyone to the American Irish Historical Society and the Irish American Heritage Museum up in Albany. We're delighted to present these events in tandem, as we've been doing for the last almost year now. Tonight we're joined by Liam Corry, who's the curator at the National Museums in Northern Ireland for over 25 years. Based at the Ulster American Folk Park outside of Omagh in County Tyrone, he's been heavily involved in the interpretation of what is one of the largest open-air museums in Ireland. He's particularly interested in creating farm landscapes around the historic houses that they have moved onto the site. And his research interests include changes in passenger flow from Derry or Londonderry over time and the Ulster Protestant migration during and after the Great Hunger. We were talking earlier on off camera just how amazing the changes kind of that the Ulster American Folk Park has been going through in its interpretation in the last couple of years. And so they really do have a range of diverse perspectives on this story from the early 18th century right the way through to the 20th century. So they don't just tell the story from the Ulster Irish point of view, but they also feature, Indigenous peoples here in America and enslaved peoples and the interactions. So tonight he's going to give us a quick look. We were saying it's a massive topic. Those of you who are interested in Ulster Irish, there are too many books to read, but he will talk to us about maybe how the patterns changed over time and possibly like the major areas where they settled in America. So I'm going to mute myself and disappear from the screen. And then those of you who are live with us, you can share a comment down in the chat or ask a question in the Q&A, and we'll look at the questions at the end of the night. So thanks very much, and take it away, Liam.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That very nice welcome. I'm really pleased to be here tonight to talk to the Irish American Heritage Museum audience. As Elizabeth has said, it's a big topic. So I'm going to try to give some sort of an overview of it. And maybe in the future, we can come back and dive into some more of the detail if that's what's wanted. I've described the talk as the Ulster Irish in America. The reason for this is, as you can see, I work at the Ulster American Folk Park, and we would interpret Ulster migration to America. But it really is, we really are looking at the Irish migration to America. Ulster is a good place to look at, because we both have that early flow, which was described as Scotch-Irish, and was thought of as mainly to the Appalachians and thought of as being maybe pre-revolutionary America. And then also we have all the elements of famine and post-famine migration from Ulster, which tend to be thought of then as generally a Catholic migration from the whole of Ireland. But hopefully, as my little talk goes on tonight, you'll see that it's much more complex than that. It's much more interested in that, and it's much more nuanced than that. So hopefully that'll be one of the takeaways that you'll have. I suppose just for a dive in, one of the reasons why we tend to think that, Scotch-Irish, early settlement, Appalachians, Ulster Presbyterians, and then, later migration being Irish Catholic and famine oriented, is because the historians who read the books and took an interest in the different people just sort of split themselves up like that and only want to look at, shall we say, one side or the other, particularly before the 1990s. The writing of the history has improved a little since that there, but it's once the ideas have been formed, it's hard to get people to think in different ways about how the migrant flow from Ireland developed. So the Ulster American Folk Park, if you don't know too much about it, it looks really, as I said, at Ulster migration from North America from 1700 to around about 1920. And then by extension, that's the whole of the Irish story to North America. We use living history to explain, we use the concept of living history to explain this migration history as mediated by visual guides telling the stories of individual families, which we'll come on to in a wee minute. Visitor guides are in costume, but unlike many American open air museums, we don't do that first person interpretation where we visit at a single point in time. It's more of a third person interpretation where they're trying to describe the life of the people over a longer period of time. Um, Ireland has seen human migration in its various forms since our ancestors started to move across Europe. We know that early man probably left Africa about 100,000 years ago, but it's only in the last 10,000 years that we've had humans on the island of Ireland. I don't intend to go into any detail on that very long history. I'll start really in the 15 and early 1600s. And in Ulster, one of the last major migrations to Ireland as a whole actually came from Scotland directly into Ulster. A lot of people now will see the sea as a bit of a barrier, but really, in that period in the past, it was easier to move by the sea than it was to move through the land. So there'd always been, a lot of movement between Ulster and Scotland, backwards and forwards, over the previous centuries. But at this point in time, we started to see a major movement from Scotland into the north of Ireland, particularly the east coast of Ireland. Um, um, and then in 1603, with the end of the 9 Years' War, um, Ulster, which has been the most Gaelic part of Ireland, then started to undergo a major change. The Irish earls who had their lands there and had been at war with the English were given favourable terms at the end of the war. But um, the earls could see the way that the wind was blowing and thought that they'd end up being imprisoned in an English jail if they hung about for too long. So the fate of the Earls occurred from the north of Ireland in 1607 from a little village in Donegal called Rathmullen. And then this led to the lands being taken over by the English Scottish people called undertakers and landlords. And this is really the start of the plantation of Ulster. And so they started to move in what would be sort of more loyal English or Scottish tenants. And by loyal, they meant really Protestant tenants who would have loyalty to the British throne, as opposed to the native Irish Catholics who'd been on the ground and had loyalty to the Irish earls who'd left. Um, this was a sort of a smallish movement during the early 1600s because the plantation of Ulster was over by 1623, but it sort of formed a sort of a spearhead, and they continued to be a small movement continually through the 1600s. There were major wars and setbacks, particularly in the 1640s and 1690s, that we've seen a number of Scots moving back to Scotland, but then they would regroup after that there and come back in. One aspect of this migration that isn't well known, we always hear about the Irish famine, but we don't hear very much about the Scottish famine, which happened between 1695 and 1699. And that saw a fairly large scale movement of Scottish people, probably the biggest movement of Scottish people from Scotland to Ireland, or the north of Ireland at that point in time. Surprisingly, although there was a famine in Scotland, there was no crop failure in the north of Ireland in that time. And because it was after the 1690 rebellion, which was put down and saw the establishment of King William on the British throne, that the north of Ireland lost quite a bit of population. So Scottish poor Scottish tenants fleeing from the famine were able to get farms on very reasonable rents. So that's the background. So that sort of establishes the Ulster Scotch or the Scotch Irish as you would know them in the north of Ireland around about that point in time, from the 1550s through to around the 1700. Now, and in terms of the migration from the north of Ireland, it's generally thought it starts off from about 1718 going to New England. Again, it's very convenient to have very different, very well differentiated created geography and a time slot, but reality was that there was a migration of Irish people from Ireland to North America as part of the general British migration from the British Isles. It wasn't caricatured in any real way, but there were plenty of people to be found in British North America during the 1600s. And by British North America, really meaning what became the United States of America, what became Canada, and also the Caribbean areas of that time. But the story from Ulster really ramps up a gear around about 1718. And at this point in time, in 1718, there's there's a bit of a crop failure in the north of Ireland. And at the same time, there's conversation between Presbyterians in the north of Ireland and Puritans in New England. The Puritans and the Presbyterians sort of share a Calvinist theology, and the Puritans think that the Presbyterians would make good settlers on their lands. They're trying to settle their lands, but in particular, they want to settle a fairly unstable frontier, um, which is quite a hot frontier in terms of the Native Americans on it, trying to push back the settlement that's occurring. So, if we look at this map, we can see here Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. These were all the areas that would have seen um, migration from the north of Ireland. Again, sometimes we have a tendency to call it the New World, but in reality, it wasn't really a new world. It was fully populated by indigenous Native American tribes, and the Abenakis in the north, I'm sure I got the pronunciation wrong, were fighting a fairly strong war against the settlement of New England at that point in time. So these settlers that were at that point in time, 1718, mainly Ulster Presbyterians, found themselves in New England. But what the Puritans found was something rather different from what they had expected. The settlers who came over from the north of Ireland were quite poor. They came with little or no capital, and they really became a burden to them. They were very inclined to push them out on the frontier, and then once on the frontier, they were quite exposed to Native American attack. So it wasn't a very very happy relationship. This migration, however, sort of continued on from about 1718 to maybe 1728, and then started to peter out. Peter out so much really that today there's not really much of a tradition of Ulster settlement in New England, but it's there in a few places. But if you look at the map, you'll see it fairly quickly in terms of the place names, because they were among the early settlers on the frontier. You find quite a lot of Belfasts and Derrys and Londonderrys and Coleraines, and the odd Donegal as well, just reflecting the geography that these migrants left behind. One of the stories that feature at the Ulster American Folk Park is the story of this guy, Edward Patterson. He would end up in Connecticut in the mid 1720s. Wee bit unusual in that he didn't exactly go out looking for land. Maybe that was one of the reasons that he was more successful. He was actually a tinsmith and one of the very early tinsmiths to end up um, in British North America, and even part of that early tradition of Yankee peddlers. Established a fairly successful business in Connecticut and then expanded it by the use of peddlers taking his wares out through New England and on down into the mid-Atlantic states. So he was one of our a success story in terms of that early migration. Then about 10 years after that, from 1725, 1728, 1730, the flow of people from Ulster started to really change. Instead of heading towards New England, they started to head towards Pennsylvania. Um, Pennsylvania was a Quaker dominated colony, and one of its main administrators was a guy called James Logan, who was from area around Portadown in the north of Ireland. So again, he looked towards Ulster and Ulster Province as being ideal settlers for this colony that he hoped to improve through having more migrants there. So he would encouraged again these people to come. Um, Again, the hook was fairly cheap farmland. And one of the attractions was here, the frontier wasn't, at that point in time anyway, wasn't quite as hot as the frontier in New England. So there was better peace treaties with the native people occupying the lands to the west of the frontier. And the land quality itself would have been quite a bit better than most of the land that was available to settlers in New England. So there's a fairly sustained large flow from the north of Ireland, from ports like Belfast, Derry, Londonderry, to then to going to places like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Newcastle, and then spreading out from there. The land had already been settled fairly close to the coast, so these people from Ulster then had to go inland, head more towards the Appalachians in order to get that sort of cheap farmland where they could start a new life for themselves. Um, this here map here would sort of show that general flow over the longer time period. Having started off in Pennsylvania, they would have moved down what became known as the Great Wagon Road down through the Appalachians, and then actually right out across the Appalachians into the west, particularly into Tennessee and Kentucky. So at our museum, we have got original houses from Pennsylvania, from West Virginia, and from Tennessee, reflecting different elements of this migration. That's just sort of a wee summary of what I was speaking about there. This house here, for the photograph, you'd be glad to know was the house before it was taken down in America. So this house here is the Fulton House. The Fultons would have been very typical of that first flow to Pennsylvania. They left a place called Melton, which is a small coastal village in North Donegal. There was a large Presbyterian settlement all along Donegal. If you think about Derry and Donegal and the border between it, they're separated by a river called the Foyle. And on two sides of the Foyle, the land was very good. So there was a lot of Scotch settlement, both in Donegal and in Derry. So our man, Samuel Fulton, left there and settled just in Lancaster County, just 50 or 60 miles west of Philadelphia. Fairly now, I suppose, in the centre of what would be considered to be Amish country. And this is the house he built. He had the Fultons, there was a family, an extended family of merchants, and Samuel Fulton himself established himself, as well as establishing himself as a farmer on the frontier, would have established himself as a merchant. And then he had another cousin or relation back in Philadelphia that he traded with. And again, even back to Melton, there was another branch of the family in Melton that would have traded with the branch in Philadelphia. That longer range trade from Philadelphia to Melton, two main elements of it would have been the linen, the linen trade and the flax trade. And that in Ireland, particularly in Ulster, especially in Ulster, there was a large flax industry producing high quality flax for things like bed sheets and for shirts. And a proportion of this would be exported to the what was British North America. And then in return, what British North America sent back to Ulster was actually flax seed. Um, Strange enough, if you grow really good flax for making linen thread, your seed is quite poor. And if you grow good seed, your thread is going to be quite poor. So there was a good relationship between the two countries in terms of the linen trade. What makes this even more interesting is it's the flax ships coming in from Philadelphia and New York, fully laden with flax early in the spring into Ulster ports, and then they're looking for a cargo to take back to America. So there's nowhere near as much linen goes back to America as flaxseed comes in. So the cargo they're looking for then is a human cargo. The There's no such thing really back then as packet ships. The migrants move across the ocean just on basically cargo ships outfitted with bunk beds for the steerage passengers. So this allows migrants from Ulster to get back to go to America reasonably cheaply on these returning flax ships. So this is a house as it is now rebuilt at the Ulster American Folk Park. Um, it's from 1730s to 1750s, so there's not much sign of any china or any delf. It's all pewter or wooden elements in the house. Um, One unusual feature of the house was that normally you have a spring house built beside your dwelling house, but this house seemed to have a feature of having the spring house within the house. So the photograph on the right hand side would show the spring house being used as a kind of a fridge to keep products they're storing there cool. And again, upstairs is a merchant, so he's storing stuff there like flax hanks and bales of flaxseed and barrels of maize or oats or wheat. So that's his Fulton house. Will not jump into slavery. Indentured servitude was one of the ways that you could get from Ulster to North America, even if you had no money at all. Quite often, the migration was families who had a small bit of capital, sometimes whole congregations, but very rarely a whole congregation would leave together and charter a ship to go to Pennsylvania. But for individual people with no real money, you could actually sell yourself to the ship's captain. And then whenever you got to America, the ship's captain would sell you for a period of indentured servitude, and that way he would get the price of the fare that you owed him back. Being an indentured servant had some similarities to slavery, but they weren't slaves. The Irish were never slaves in the way we think about chattel slavery for Africans at that period in time. After 7 years, they would be released. But during the period of indentured servitude, they could be treated very, very harshly. Many would run away, and if they were found and brought back, they would be whooped, or they could be whooped for not obeying rules. But in general, there was more laws to protect them than there was for African slaves at that point in time. So similar, but not the same thing. Sometimes people do confuse this idea that the Irish were slaves, but in reality, they weren't chattel slaves in the way that African Americans will be described as chattel slaves. Similarly, this house has a very interesting history. Um, if you know of indigenous massacres, there was quite a famous massacre that took place close to this house in the 1763 as part of the French and Indian War. Um, Most of the Native Americans in and around the Lancaster area had been moved on. They had been given a sort of reservation called Conestoga Manor by the Penn family themselves, but surprising enough, over time, the treaty had been reneged on, and that large manor of maybe 10,000 good acres had got smaller and smaller and smaller. The Native Americans that were living there, they were known as the Conestoga Indians, but in reality, they were Susquehannock Indians who had stayed on there. They kind of taken on white ways of living and had become Christians. But during the French and Indian War, the local Ulster migrants that were in the vast majority of this area, it was one of the most Ulster places in the whole of America. They turned on them and were very suspicious of them and ended up committing a massive massacre of them. The massacre was quite unusual and that was widely reported. And there was a massive pamphlet war after it, both sides. One basically given out about how bad these people had been, and then another side of the pamphlet war sort of supporting what they'd done and basically saying that, the Native American threat has to be put down at all costs. And in reality, it was the put down at all costs idea of Native American massacres that won out. And because what happened in that massacre was kind of repeated over and over again as settlement moved across North America. Um, Another house we have is, again, this house here is from northern Tennessee. It's called the Rogan House. So this is a shot of the house as it would have appeared before it when it was still in America. Let's see. We don't have all the house because if you can see there on the right hand side, there's kind of you see the stone built house. The stone built house was actually moved to another museum outside Gallatin before we acquired the rest of the house. So we acquired the brick built extension. So the Rogan story, it sounds like a very Scotch Irish story. Rogan leaves Strabane just before the American War of Independence in 1775 with the idea of going out to see what the land's like and then bringing back his wife and young child a year or two later when he goes back to Ireland. However, the Revolutionary War intervenes and Rogan is caught up in it, first of all as a soldier, and then later on in the war, he's involved in making maps in northern Tennessee. Then when the war is over, he goes back with a group of settlers into northern Tennessee and stays there because he's one of those very early settlers and what becomes known as the Cumberland Compact. He's given quite a large area of land to settle on. He's very well known as an Indian fighter and renowned in white circles at any rate as a great hero in that area. He had all the hallmarks of an Ulster Presbyterian, but actually this guy here is not an Ulster Presbyterian. This guy here is an Irish Catholic from outside Strabane. And surprisingly enough, the family actually keep the Catholicism down through the years. There is a number of Catholics mixed into that so-called Ulster Presbyterian Scotch Irish settlement, but you don't really see them in history for two reasons. And the main reason being that having a religion is really important. And when you get out to America and you don't have your own church there, then whatever church is close at hand will probably be better than having no church. There is elements of the Catholic Church out there, particularly in Maryland, but you have to remember that before the Revolutionary War, the penal laws were still in operation in America, so the Catholic Church out there was kind of banned. You would have had Jesuit missionaries going out to administer to both to Indigenous people at times and then also to the population, and that's really how the Rogan family ended up keeping their faith over maybe a period of 40 or 50 years before the Catholic Church caught up with a diocesan structure that they were able to, sort of hear mass on a regular basis on. So this is the Rogan House now reconstructed at our museum. as I said, that element of the house would never have stood like that on its own. So we marked out in chalk beside it where the original house would have been to sort of give a better idea of how the house would have worked as a functioning unit. Rogan himself wasn't reunited with his wife for another 20 years. He believed that she had remarried in Ireland and he didn't go back to get her because he thought it would cause her embarrassment. But eventually he gets word that she's still kind of waiting on him. So he goes back, brings his wife back with his young child, who's now 20. And when they get back to America, him and the wife have another child. And it's actually the second child, along with the wife, who built this very high quality brick house in around about 1814. Another view of the house, and that's you can just about see on the right hand side on the grass slope there the outline of the original house. This house here has a difficult history in that Tennessee was a state where slavery was legal, and the Rogan family actually become very successful because they get involved in plantation agriculture. And by the time of the American Civil War, they own around about 70 enslaved people. So part of the interpretation of the house here, we're actually able to grow tobacco, and that helps us talk in more practical terms about how the house is so grand. Because if you go to the park and you went around all the houses, you probably think that's a house that I could most easily live in. But that is why it was based around plantation agriculture. And then similarly here, only this year we know that the house had maybe upwards of 10 enslaved cabins associated with it by 1860. So we've put in outlines of four of the cabins here just to sort of highlight the difference in the living conditions of the African of the Black Americans and the enslavers. We have a small garden that would have been associated with one of the cabins because that happened very often on the plantations in that area. Inside the house, fairly well finished. We have a picture of Andrew Jackson on the wall because we know the family were quite well associated with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson actually had a plantation not that far away and grew up in a similar area and probably would have moved. They probably would have moved in the early days in similar social circles. Again, because we're talking around about 1810, mostly pewter and no real china in the house. Upstairs bedrooms. We'll move on past that. That's a photograph from the 1870s of Francis Rogan, who was our first migrant's second son, and who built the plantation up into what it was before the American Civil War. One of the main story that we actually tell at the Ulster American Folk Park is the melon story. I don't know how familiar you might be with it, but you'll still find in New York the Melon Bank, New York, isn't it? I think it's undergone a few name changes. So they would have been um, up there with Carnegie and Rockefeller, in the 1910s, 1920s. So the patriarch of the family left exactly where our museum is, because this is the only house. This is the house on its original site. This is the house the museum is based around. So they left in 1818. Thomas Mellon himself didn't leave with any agency. It was his father, Samuel, who made the decision to leave. Left in 1818. The rest of his family had already moved out there. I think the intention was that Samuel would stay in Ulster. He had a decent farm of maybe about 20 acres, which doesn't sound a lot now, but back then, of course, he didn't own it. It was only rented, but he heard such good stories from America, from the rest of the family that had moved out there, that he thought there wasn't much point struggling on in the north of Ireland when there was such potential in America. So he went to America, sold his possessions and his lease, and was able to go to America and actually borrow some money and buy land, which would have been unthinkable in Ireland. The family were very successful in America. This is just I'm conscious I'm running out of time and talking in too much depth. That's a problem I have sometimes. Um, Pictures of the house in Ireland, but they make their journey to America on quite a small sailing ship called the Brig. Um, Again, this is a photograph from the museum, and we have a full scale replica of a big sailing ship that would have sailed around at that point in time, 1820. Surprisingly enough, they didn't go directly to Philadelphia. It was much cheaper to take the ship to Canada. The same way that the flax trade was really important for moving migrants across the ocean in the 1750s, 1760s. By 1810, 1820, 1830, it was the Canadian timber trade that was bringing full ships into British ports, and then empty ships heading back across the ocean. So quite often these ships could be filled with Irish migrants on quite cheap fares. They've been dropped off in New Brunswick, St. John's, New Brunswick, and then they've got a schooner from St. John's, New Brunswick, in our case, down to Baltimore, and that was much cheaper than to sail directly there. So that's how the family ended up in the coast of America. They went out to close to Pittsburgh and bought themselves a small farm from a German family. And this was kind of a replica of the log cabin that they stayed in, that they bought. Uh, a few inside views of it. But within 7 or 8 years, they done really quite well, even though there was a major crash after they bought the land in 1819, 1820. And they were able to buy more land and build themselves quite a substantial two-story log farmhouse. Down in the bottom corner there is a photograph of the young Thomas Mellon. Now, as I said, up to this point, all the direction, most of the energy of the Ulster migrants was directed towards getting farmland. And although Thomas Mellon's father, Samuel, uh, would have been very successful over his lifetime in accumulating farmland, was a success story in itself. Thomas didn't want to follow down that route, and he was very inclined to go for education. He got a good education, and he became a lawyer and then a barrister and then a judge. Done very well for himself, but in his dealings as a barrister and a lawyer, he saw great opportunities in the banking industry, and he started off the first Mellon Bank in downtown Pittsburgh. And from that small bank, it survived the banking crisis of 1873 and really took off. It was kind of it was more of a merchant bank. There's also a commercial bank as well, but it thrived. It ended up, investing, lending money to some of the major industries, the coal industry, the gas industry, and then the oil industry as it developed, and the carbide industry. They just seem to make all the right decisions in terms of where to invest and where to put the bank's money, and that was why Thomas Mellon did really well, but then his son's done even better, and the bank really took off in the late um, 1800s and early 1900s. So massive success story. And again, some views of the inside of the house. Um, so, I mean, the Mellon story is part of that sort of Scotch-Irish story as well, but it's getting to a point then after the Napoleonic Wars where you're starting to see less um, not less migration from Ulster, but more migration from the rest of Ireland. Now, you should very quickly say that there was quite a smattering of Irish Celtic migration into all those sort of Ulster crossing migrations that we were talking about. And the reason that we know this that because they weren't that well written about, but the reason that we know that they're there, apart from the Rogan story, is that they left their mark in the first census of 1790 in the United States. Because when you look through that census, you can see a lot of Gaelic Irish surnames there. It's harder. There's quite a few Scottish names there, but it's very hard to differentiate, who came from Scotland and who came from the north of Ireland because the surnames are so familiar. But when we get to the 1820s, we're starting to see more of a Catholic flow mixed in with the Presbyterian flow, particularly from Ulster and even more particularly from the rest of Ireland. When I skip through that there, I'm just going to go very quickly to 1845. We have this here Single cabin, which would been very typical of that smaller cabin that so many people in Ireland would have lived. This would have been untypical in that it survived the famine, and we were able to bring it into the folk park from the Sperrins, from County Derry. The size and the shape of the cabin very much typical, but a stone construction meant that it would have been a bit stronger than, maybe about 70-80% of the cabins that you would have seen, because most cabins were just built out of sod walls. And so once the people would have left them, they'd have fallen on themselves. But in terms of material culture inside the house, might even have as many chairs as you see there. There's two chairs you can see, so it might have been maybe just more stools, turf fire, and some cooking pots, or a single cooking pot for the potatoes. And that really was the story of the house to a certain extent. Very typical scene from just before the famine, the start of the famine. Now, the important part of this slide, although people don't particularly like statistics, and it's much nicer to talk about family stories, there's quite this idea that, the famine didn't really affect Ulster, and Ulster was unaffected by the famine, and, Ulster province, they were self-reliant and didn't need any help. But the real story of the famine is the loss of those class four houses. We're very lucky in that with the census in 1841 and 1851, which looked at the sort of houses we had, and that house there that a cabin I showed you, was known as a class four house. Now, in the whole of Ireland, 1841, there was nearly 500,000 of those cabins. By 1851, which is more or less the end of the famine, we're down to 135,000. That's a loss of a third of a million of those cabins. Now, you take it, each of those cabins would have held between 4 and 5 people, probably around about 5 people. So that's 1.5 million people gone out of those cabins, at least 1.5 million people gone out of those cabins alone, and didn't move to a better house. There's only two options really where those 1.5 million people go. Either they migrated or they died because the cabins were gone. There was only a small increase in houses and other house types. So again, you might think, oh well, it probably happened in most of the rest of Ireland. Sure, Ulster was much better off, and blah blah blah. If we look actually at the figures, we'll see, 1841, Ulster had about 125,000 of those houses. By the end of it, the period down to 23,000. You might think, oh well, maybe it was those more Celtic counties like Donegal and Cavan and Monaghan. That's where they were all lost. But in reality, the biggest losses in percentages terms were County Antrim, County Tyrone, County Down, County Fermanagh, and also Donegal. I mean, it didn't really matter what part of Ulster that you looked at. There was a massive loss in population. The only reason, there's a couple of reasons that we have this myth that, the famine didn't really happen in Ulster. I mean, Skibbereen and the southwest of Ireland was so bad that Ulster wasn't quite as bad. But if you weren't looking at Skibbereen to make a comparison with, and you just looked at some parts of Ulster, it had been the most awful famine you could ever have imagined. Then the other narrative was that the powers that be in Ulster wanted to have this myth of, Ulster Protestants can look after themselves, whereas, the Irish Catholics and the rest of the country are a bit feckless. So they wanted to ignore deaths and wanted to push them to one side and pretend they weren't happening. But the statistics don't really lie here. There was a massive famine in Ulster. Probably a slight difference in Ulster was that because there was more of a history of migration to North America, the paths were already well worn. One of the elements of migration that happens is that when you have people going out, they tend to send money back home quite often in the form of prepaid fares. And this has been happening like the whole way through from the 1750s onwards. But it really seemed to have ramped up, during the famine, where anybody in America that had relatives in Ireland that were under pressure, they tried to get them out to America by send them money. And again, we can see just, there's always a lot of talk about the number of, Ulster Scotch migrants that went out, you know, pre-1800 or even pre-revolutionary America. In reality, the numbers actually left Ireland would have been very small. I know the line doesn't go back to the 1700s. The line would be down at the bottom of that graph. There's a massive spike during from 1845 to 1855. And my own research in the port of Derry, Londonderry, shows that there was more Protestants leaving the port than there was Catholics leaving the port over the time period from 1845 to 1850. So the history has been written in a very spec sort of way. There was more of a Scotch Irish presence in the famine migrants than there was in earlier migrations, but that didn't fit in with the heroic story that early historians want to write about this, and didn't really fit in with the Irish Catholic story of being the victims of an uncaring British government. So we sort of have these two streams that don't really mix, but they mixed the whole way through. I'm just conscious I'm coming up to around about 45 minutes now, so I'm going to bring this part to a close and answer any questions that you might have. Let's see. Just to briefly talk about one or two more slides. In relation with the famine, I would have mentioned that we also have the boyhood home of, oh, sorry, I went too fast there. We have the boyhood home of John Joseph Hughes, who, as you all know, laid the foundation stone or had the idea behind the building of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan in New York. He's a massive figure in Irish Catholic America. We could spend a whole lecture talking about him on his own, but very much associated with the famine Irish, and also associated with really trying to take the famine Irish from where they landed and help them get on their feet. Both in terms of the Irish Migrants and Industrial Savings Bank and immigrant societies that he helped set up. Another house that we have that would be less well known to yourselves would be the Robert Campbell story. He didn't leave really from poverty. As you can see, this is the house if we have at the Ulster Folk Park. They were fairly well off, but decided to go to America to seek his fortune. Two brothers left. One was Hugh, one was Robert. Third brother stayed at home in the house to look after the farm. They had connections, but Robert actually ends up going out straight to the Rocky Mountains. If you've seen the film The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio, he's involved in that same sort of enterprise, and involved in trading with the indigenous people and trapping beaver furs. It's very successful. He starts with little capital and comes back. First of all, his life, which is good because it's a very, very difficult life out there to survive, but also comes back with enough capital to get himself established as a merchant in St. Louis. This actually is a picture of his house in St. Louis. It's still there. It's actually the Campbell House Museum. Campbell's story is so interesting because his contacts with Indigenous people in the Rocky Mountains sort of show the whole story from sort of early contact and trading on sort of equal terms with white people. And at the end of his life, Robert Campbell, as a merchant, has done so well. He's actually supplying Indian reservations with handouts as part of federal contracts. Um, because he knows Native people so well, he's given the job of an Indian commissioner to oversee the work of the Federal Bureau for Indian Affairs. He ends up resigning from that because of the amount of corruption that he sees. For every $10 is put into the bureau, maybe only $1 or $2 as he gets onto the reservation and where it should be going because of the amount of corruption within it. Now, to be fair, although he might see himself as a friend to Native American people, he wasn't really a friend. He had the same attitude that everybody at the time had, and that was basically the way to solve the Indian problem was to kill the Indian to save the man. So basically, it was to eradicate indigenous culture, turn them all into white people, which was an attitude that really, I suppose, kept going for like another 100 years after that, right into the 1960s, maybe 1970s. So that's another one of the stories I have. Like I said, so many fascinating stories that we could do such a deep dive on Campbell House. And we start off very often a very slight negative, and that although we talked there about how we do tell the family story quite well, we don't have that second part of the migration element of the family story. We don't have stories from the tenements in New York, and really I mean, the classic example of that is in your own city with the Tenement Museum. And really, to balance the story out, we need to have maybe 3 or 4 tenement stories, developed through a living history interpretation to show that, Ulster Protestants, Ulster Catholics, they end up in very similar but parallel lives in tenements in big cities like New York. The the early flow to the countryside that we interpret so well in the museum. Um, Unfortunately, the way we do it, it tends to suggest that that was the main flow from Ulster, whereas in reality there was a bigger flow of people, both Catholics and Protestants, to the cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco. They were the big hubs after 1850, and that's when the big numbers went out. So we need to get that balance going forward in the future. So it's just to be honest, where a museum is. So I'm going to bring my presentation to an end there, and if there's questions, I'm happy to take them.
Okay, good. Am I coming back in? I'm not sure. So
Yeah.
yeah, I seem to have show stuff. Okay, good. Yeah, that's amazing. I don't know why we can't see everything, but anyway, do you want to stop sharing maybe and
I'll stop
then
sharing. Yeah, that'll be good. I'll do that.
oh good, there I am.
There we
That was fascinating, and you're right, Liam. It's such a huge topic. I've taken notes, and I don't know that we'll get to everything. So I'll wait. If any of you have questions or comments, please do pop them in the chat or the Q&A. One of the things that struck me when I was looking at the rebuilt and they're not recreations, like they were shipped over, right? These homes. So I thought the style of architecture was surprisingly different from the one room cabin that some of them would have come out of in Ulster. Is there a reason why, like the design, not to mind the materials, is different? I was surprised to see so many brick instead of log cabins. I had this idea of Daniel Boone in a log cabin, but they
Yeah,
were
yeah,
stone, and mortar it looked like, and dormer windows, very different.
yeah. I mean, again, I, I don't think maybe our museum would be completely reflective of all the typical architectural styles that Irish migration may have occupied in America. I mean, the first house that we had there from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, uh, yeah, you'd be kind of surprised seeing a stone house as the first house that you meet whenever you go to the American side of the museum. But that's what we had, a great story associated with it. But yeah, you're a wee bit surprised. Next house you Then after that, there what you come to is the smaller log cabin, and then the larger two-story log house that would be associated with the Mellon family. They were two houses that were built when the park opened back in 1976. So those were actually two replica houses, but would have been so well researched at the time. One of the reasons that the first house doesn't exist anymore, the first log cabin in the Mellons wouldn't exist anymore, but the second house is actually still been lived in. Only it's been refurbished and built around, but the core house is still there. So, and then we have a third house that in Surrey would be a typical Appalachian house, and then a fourth house, which is an all log cabin, would be more of a typical West Virginian house, and then the Rogan house is a wee bit of an outlier because it was on a plantation. Brick houses, yeah, that was high quality, and then just reflective of the money that they were making.
And I suppose the materials that are available to them, too, if they're way out in the boondocks, like yeah. So Lawrence has a question, sort of semi-related to your last comment there. How prominent were Scots Irish and/or Catholic Irish in the Southern planter class by the time of the American Civil War? And is their role in the Southern plantation represented in your museum's historical interpretation? So I think yes is kind of the answer for that last bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So this Rogan house that we're talking about there, that would be very much the number of slaves and slave people that they owned by the start of the American Civil War meant that they were in the top 5% of the planter slave owning class at that point in time, with around 70 enslaved people.
Is huge amount, yeah.
That's a lot. Next level up, you're looking at the sort of that gone with the one sort of thing,
Yeah.
maybe like 200 or 300 enslaved people, and you have that a really big mansion. But
yeah.
The Rogans were doing really well, and we do try to reflect on on what enslavement meant, both and how well the Irish family did, but then the negative aspects of it as well.
I would ask you, Liam, do they comment themselves, like the way some of these plantation owners kept records? It may just have been bills of sale and all that. Like, do they ever seem to struggle with it? It's interesting that they were Catholic, kind of, because I know sometimes the Bible is used to justify slavery, and as Catholics don't generally read the Bible. Does he struggle, or is it just like purely economic? You know what I mean? That like we have this huge farm, I need people to work it. It is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, the Jesuits had plantations in the southern states. The Catholic Church had plantations in the southern states. Yeah. John Hughes himself actually he goes to work in order to get into the seminary, into the Catholic training college. He actually works in the gardens there because he has a bit of a background as a gardener. His job at the seminary at the Catholic priest college, his job is actually to oversee slaves. And Hughes himself has a great deal of sympathy for these slaves and slave people that he meets at that point in time as a young man. Strange enough, if you know much about Hughes, as time goes on, his feelings change completely, and he's influenced in a completely different way. And that's actually, I really like Hughes' story because he's so reflective of Irish migration, because before Irish people are leaving Ireland, they're very influenced by Daniel O'Connell, who's is a complete abolitionist and very against it. And Hughes gives off about O'Connell interfering in American affairs. And in reality, when the Irish sailed across the ocean, within a few weeks, they've all moved over to Hughes's idea of, we've got bad jobs. We don't need these free black people to compete with us for these really difficult jobs that are our jobs by rights, whatever rights they had to have the jobs. But yeah, so that's that to the north. Go back to Lawrence's question about in the south. Most, I wouldn't want to put a percentage on it, but you're probably talking, always that sort of 70% or more of migration from Ireland or Ulster ended up, in north of the Mason-Dixon line, and then 30% south of the Mason-Dixon line. Wherever you ended up, that's how you felt about things. If you're part of that white slaveholding community, that you felt that was the right way to go. Um, on the northern side, it was quite interesting because the Irish Catholics would have tended to be on balance more against emancipation, whereas you would have found northern Protestants to be more along the abolitionist idea. Strange enough, abolitionism goes along with temperance and
Yeah.
goes along with anti-migrant feeling. So the Catholics end up being on the other side of that there. They weren't particularly, I know the Catholic Church would be in favour of temperance. In general, Catholics weren't too in favour of temperance, and they certainly weren't and they were pro migrants. So it makes for an interesting a discussion about how things work out when
Yeah.
people move across an
And I
ocean.
think there's all kinds of factors like the urban, landscape here in cities for Catholics, the economics, where you are on the ladder. Like it was interesting, to talk about the Irish, and I'm glad you clarified, because it is a kind of a recurring myth, in Irish America that the Irish were slaves. And of course, there's a massive difference to be codified in law, like as property, and your children to be born into slavery. So you're absolutely
Yeah,
right. And I think indentured servants were often treated a lot worse than a very valuable enslaved person because that was an asset and property that you'd invested in. But they are free after 3 to 7 years. They are sometimes,
yeah,
paid
yeah,
off and all of that jazz.
yeah.
And we see initially a lot of, kind of intermarriage, particularly in the Caribbean, or I don't know, marriage, but Virginia, sometimes the Caribbean, this interaction between indentured servants and enslaved people who run away together, for instance, or marry. And then when the children are now going to be enslaved as well, is
Yeah.
when it starts to kind of break open or break apart. I
Yeah,
mean.
it's quite an interesting one. There's been, a bit of work done on this here, and what you tend to see at the start is that the Irish and the black communities are making they've common cause at the start, but there seems to be, and I'm paraphrasing a wee bit, but as time goes on, 10, 15 years goes on, that the Irish end up seeing themselves where they're white, so they get themselves up the ladder a bit better, and they move away from that idea of wanting to
Yeah.
have common cause with the black community. Now, that isn't to say that it was like just split like that there. It wasn't. There was always that, of course, between the two, but over times they seem to have moved further apart. I mean, and one of the worst episodes of that was, in New York you have the draft
Draft
riots, but
riots.
like they're also it's also part of a black massacre by of black free black New Yorkers by
Mhm.
Irish in New York. Like that's on the tone of it as well. Which
Mhm.
but there was intermarriage. There was no one's ever thought a better word, black and
Here,
white.
yeah,
You
either
know,
or, yeah.
there's so many nuances, but there's general run there that's not something to be very proud of from an Irish point of view.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, sometimes the Irish get a little bit conflated as just being there was working class New Yorkers also involved in those riots. There was not just
Yeah,
Irish, particularly with the draft. Um, you mentioned, I thought at the end, very interesting, the lack, we'll say, of information about the Ulster Irish in the cities. And of course, we know in New York that we had a couple of years of orange riots, so that'd be
yeah.
a good place to start. Yeah.
Strange, yes, just but you see that was a problem. Like because I've tried, working where I work and having an interest that I have, and the
Yeah.
only times that you can find the Ulster Protestant Irish is when they're in conflict, as in
Yeah.
the Orange
Yeah.
riots, or there's also riots in early 1840s before the famine in Philadelphia over weavers.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
it's quite interesting that on the two sides of the barricades, the two sides of the riots, you have Irish Catholics, but then you have Irish Protestants on the the Native American side, as they would call themselves, only just off
Mm.
the boat. But the thing about Ulster Protestants is because they're white, they're Anglo-Saxon, they fit in so easily in American society. They're very easily absorbed there. They're very comfortable there. Americans are very comfortable to have them there very soon off the boat and don't see them as migrants in the same way
Mhm.
that they'll see Irish Catholics as being migrants and foreign. And, maybe because in that point in time, we pretend to get the Vatican. was still very strong in terms of political power. And
Mm.
so you're a suspect that you mightn't, you might actually be answering to a foreign a foreign government. Again, the Orange Order then in those later riots in the 1870s, I think it was,
Mm.
when the final ones occur. It's difficult to retain the Orange Order in New York compared to Canada because
Yeah.
Canada is loyal to the British Crown, so it's very easy to have all the paraphernalia and Ulster around what the Orange Order would have had. Whereas in America, you can't really be an American and be
Mhm.
really
Lawyer to King Billy.
an Orange Order.
Yeah.
You kind of have to drop that, and you know, you find that that riot is a last real. I mean, the Orange Order exists there for many years after
Yeah.
that there, but that's the
And
last
I
time
think
that
in
you.
the South, quite, up until
Yeah,
quite recently, kind of, yeah.
yeah.
Tennessee and
Oh no, it was there, but it never had the same. Whenever you see what the Orange Order is able to do in Canada or Australia or New Zealand, it's very minor,
yeah,
really,
well, you
in
can't
the.
square it with American patriotism.
Yeah. And the problem that I have is then it's really difficult to get a group that represents um, Ulster Protestants, whether they're Anglicans or Presbyterians or whatever. You can find Ulster Catholics or Irish Catholics reasonably easy, in terms of the way the history is written. But,
Mhm.
you know, before the Irish famine, you can find Ulster Protestants reasonably well written about. But after
Mhm.
that, they just disappear. They become white Americans just so
Yeah,
easily that
yeah.
they just almost evaporate.
And it's
But
funny, Liam, because you mentioned it like that the Irish, kind of take over the identity, and that's not necessarily all their own doing either. Like when you look at a city, kind of Chicago or Boston or New York with the political machine, like the pushback against this idea, like that Irish equals Catholic equals clannish, and party machine and block voting and all
yeah,
this. So
yeah,
that kind of is a negative. Even our own, the American Irish Historical Society was founded in 1897, technically in Boston, but it really was to try to reclaim the more upper levels of Irish, in brackets Catholic. They're non-sectarian, but there were
yeah,
certainly Irish Catholics who were kind of annoyed at being associated with blue collar Tammany Hall Catholic, peasant inner city dwelling.
yeah,
And so they were like, we're also lawyers and doctors, and it wasn't just the Scots Irish. So it
yeah,
seems like the three groups, the Americans, the Irish, and the Scots, all sort of conspired to disappear those connections.
yeah. No, it is very. It's always so much more nuanced, and the story
Yeah.
gets so much interesting. If you get the detail, it's quite hard to get that. I mean, what you have, particularly after the famine, starts off maybe before the famine, but particularly after the famine, you have the idea of the Scotch Irish and Scotch Irish society, and they really are trying to differentiate
Mhm.
themselves from what they see as basically the famine Irish, and they try to make themselves a very different history.
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, the Irish Catholics are quite happy to go along with that there because they see themselves in a very different way and have a
Yeah.
very different relationship with how they see British misrule in Ireland over
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
a number of centuries. And then the historians get pulled into that. There's the history books get
Yeah,
written,
one way or the other. Mhm.
and they must self perpetuate, and it's hard to move away from them. And as with any myth, there's always an element of truth
Mhm.
within the stories, but it's not the full truth.
Mhm. No one else is asking questions. I don't want to seem. I had one silly question, and maybe there isn't an answer. But in one of the last homes that you showed, the recreation inside or the house, the bed was in the middle of the floor instead of up against a wall. Is that because of
Yeah,
mice or something, or
yeah. Not a
usual?
silly question, but probably a very poor quality answer. um, the way that people slept and use space in all houses,
Hmm.
say even up until, I don't know, I won't really put a date on it, but definitely in our time period, um, even the way we have the beds laid out and the way we probably think too much of bedrooms as bedrooms, whereas these are
Right.
rooms that are multifunctional. I mean, in Ireland, like we'd had things like a
Settle
settle
beds.
bed,
Hmm.
where basically during the day it's a bench type seat,
Yeah.
and at night time it falls out onto a bed. Um, people, there was a lack of beds. You know, as we would see a bed, it was just like a shakedown bed in Ireland. Having a decent bed that looked like a bed, it showed that you were quite well off.
Okay. Yeah.
And
So you might
so
receive people in your bedroom. Like,
yes. Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, your bed might be one of your most expensive pieces of furniture, and you'd be very inclined to show it off. I mean, I don't think, a lot of open air museums our own included, have really completely got their heads around how did this house space really work?
work.
We
Yeah.
have elements of it there, but it's not really pulled together as well that I wouldn't like to go into a house and try to describe, how this worked out from day to day or over the seasons.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just not that easy. So no, it's not a stupid question, but it's just a poor quality answer.
So I'm amazed at somebody ringing the place at nearly 7 o'clock at night. Um, yeah. So I don't know if anyone else doesn't have a question. I suppose we can let go. I thought it was fantastic, Liam. Like, there's obviously loads more. Oh, I did have one last question. Sorry, and I know you didn't touch on it because it's a huge topic. The whole cultural contribution, the music and those traditions. We know kind of bluegrass evolved out of Irish music. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah. Again, it's important to be careful about what you try to claim and what you don't try to claim.
We
At
claim it
the
all.
Ulster at the Ulster Folk Park, um, one of our biggest event is a bluegrass festival where we bring American acts over. We have Irish acts and we have European acts. So that bluegrass element is very important. Um, I had a bit of a relationship there with a group of African Americans with Irish that had Irish roots as well, and
Oh,
one of them gave me a beautiful phrase because he really liked the positivities between um, American Irish culture and Black African American culture, and he gave us a phrase. What's his was fiddle, fiddle, banjo, jump, dance, and jig to try to sort of represent, that interplay of ideas,
yeah.
and in New York, I know I talked about the riots, for example.
Mhm.
There's some great stories about um, dance-offs between
Yeah.
Irish dancers and Black American African dancers.
Mhm.
So, and then again, in the Appalachians, the music from the enslaved people, the blues that the enslaved people brought, that old time mountain music. There's a lot of streams that run
Mhm.
together. I mean, to be fair, I think they can trace a lot of tunes back to Scotland. Maybe came through Ulster and then went to
Mhm.
America and some nations and gets incorporated into bluegrass music. So there's all those roots there that
Mhm.
run.
The
I mean,
fusion. Mhm.
yeah, that's a fusion. This idea of culture appropriation, which is a very negative thing, but the fusion
Yeah.
idea is a much more positive thing, and I think much more
Yeah.
reflective of what
We
what
just
really
had
happened.
a crew in last week here in the Society, Cultural Connections, and it was musicians from Ghana and Irish American, traditional Irish music. And oh, it was amazing. They've and we have had up in Albany Mick Maloney from NYU, God rest him, before he died, obviously, and Lenny
Yeah, no, Mick,
Sloan
Mick was a great
talking.
fella.
Oh
He
my
he
God,
was
yeah.
such a loss,
Yeah,
not to have him
yeah.
around anymore. He
Yeah, so
was
Lenny
such a
Sloan is still
great fella.
talking, it was so what a beautiful, and I think you're right, like there's so many potentially negative things to the history that even our own, the Irish story itself. So it's great to be able to focus on the kind of mutual contributions and to see art able to transform, sort of lives, I think is beautiful. Yeah. So look, we'll leave it there. I don't think anyone is coming in with questions. For those of you who are in New York, we're in person next Monday at 6 o'clock with David Staller and a couple of more cohorts from the Gingold Theatre Group. They're going to talk about a scintillating show party because they're doing a run at the moment in a theatre downtown about of The Devil's Disciple with an all-female cast and a kind of reimagining. And then we're back online on Wednesday, the 20th at 6 o'clock with a talk about Ireland's Spanish children, Archbishop McQuaid, and the adoptions out of Ireland. A fairly hard topic. So keep an eye on the websites. Liam will definitely have you back. We had Rebecca recently talking about Ulster Halloween traditions, so that's on the website for those of you if you missed it. And I know next year we're going to have the Bad Bridget people over from Ulster University and the Witches of Island McGee too. So we're not leaving out Ulster from our talks. So it'll be great. And we'll have you back, Ian, too, to talk about something else.
Yeah.
So great.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, everyone. We really enjoyed it, and I hope you all enjoyed too.
All the best.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.